guess format is lots of time for questions.
So I'll get the hang of this, I promise. So we're going to have some question and answer sessions for Dr. Sapolsky, and then I'm up here because we've also got a number of people that are, even though they can't observe the talk, they have some questions they'd like to contribute.
Great.
And so, and then and for those of you that are here, we have a volunteer with a microphone. So if you have a question that you would like to ask, please raise your hand, and he will get the microphone over to you. Krishna, right up here up front.
Dr. Sapolsky, such an honor to to make eye contact with you. It's super awesome. My name is Ruth Werner, and I'm a massage therapy educator. For many years, people in my field have looked at cortisol as a stress marker. And my understanding is we associate cortisol with sort of the low-grade, long-term stress as opposed to the we're all going to die right now kind of stress. Yep. But Dr. Moyer here has done some... I didn't set this up. No, you didn't. No, you totally didn't. And challenging whether cortisol is actually changed with massage therapy. And I'm just wondering what you think about cortisol as a marker for long-term low-grade stress.
Okay, great. There is this dichotomy between epinephrine, adrenaline, sympathetic nervous system, and an acute stressful crisis and anxiety disorders, cortisol, glucocorticoids, chronic stress, chronic psychosocial stress, major depression. This is this classic dichotomy, and what you get coming out of that is cortisol is the villain in every single scenario of stress-related disease. Except it turns out that it's not true. And the organizing concept in that whole field is what people call the inverse U relationship between cortisol levels and outcome. You got an optimal level, and if you have too little cortisol, there's all sorts of things that don't work well. If you got too much, there's all sorts of, it does this. What you want is just a little bit of stress. What's a little bit of stress? It's what we call stimulation. Moderate, transient stressors activate all sorts of great things. Enhances immune defenses, increases oxygen and glucose delivery to the brain, enhances memory, all of that. It is only when you get past the point of it being stimulatory that you fall into the range where it does exactly the opposite. The brain has evolved this brilliant way to pull this off. It's got two different classes of receptors for cortisol. One of them is 10 times more sensitive than the other. So you get the first hiccup of stimulation coming out of the normal range. The more sensitive ones are the ones mediating all the good stuff. It goes on and on and on. You swamp those good receptors and start filling up the ones that mediate the bad effects. You get this inverse use. So it's totally clear. It's absolutely perfect. Of course, the question becomes, so what counts as each person's optimal stress? Because there's massive individual differences in that. What they have is, once you sort of define it for each person's like personal makeup, what you see is what transient stress is about when it's working well is it's moderately challenging. It doesn't go on for too long, and it's a setting that overall feels benevolent. Like when you get into a roller coaster, you don't get on thinking there's a chance you're going to be decapitated. There's a chance you're going to feel queasy. When you get on a roller coaster, it's for a 3-minute ride, not a 3-week-long ride. Moderate transient stressors feel great when they're in a circumstance of benevolence and safety. That's what play is. What play is daring the world to surprise you, being willing to give up control and predictability in order to be surprised, because when it's in a good setting, it's great. We love it. We pay good money to be stressed, to see a scary movie, to take a roller coaster ride. We need it in that optimal range. So cortisol has this very, very challenging, even to the extent that, like, the thing that cortisol most definitively does, what it does is suppress the immune system. Steroidal anti-inflammatories, 60 years worth of clinical use of that. A moderate increase in cortisol levels enhances immune defenses, enhances inflammation. So the theme over and over is this inverse U. Too little can be just as bad as too much. Does this fit with your sense of things?
Well, wouldn't it be something if I said, no, Yes, no, yes, it absolutely does, and it also connects to, other, among the small group of people who focus on massage therapy scientifically as their main focus, most other prominent people who do that have pointed directly to cortisol, specifically the reduction of cortisol, as being the mechanism of effect that brings about other benefits like reduction of anxiety and depression and so on. And I went into, when I did meta-analyses, thinking that that would be the case, that we would find reductions of cortisol. And I've now done several of them, and the result is very consistent. The effect on cortisol is very small, and yet the benefits in some cases are very large in the statistical sense. And so I've tried to get the word out that that can't be the mechanism. So,
which fits very well with the meditation literature as well.
yes, and I've done a little research on that area too.
Yeah, so it's not one hormone that's the main villain, and it's not always villainous. It's getting it in the optimal range.
Thank you. We have another question in the back.
Do you want to just shout it out, and I'll paraphrase if it's quiet.
Okay. Yeah, I have a question about the effects of analgesia with stress. So some of the studies that have come out when they talk about it in terms of exercise, they call it exercise-induced hypoalgesia, which I'm assuming is the same thing.
Yep.
And then there have been some populations that have been identified that seem to have an impairment to be able to bring this about, and it's not. So my question is, you mentioned that there are some times that maybe that becomes exhausted, but there's populations, like for example with chronic low back pain, that this has not been shown to be present, but there are other groups that it has, like people who've been diagnosed with fibromyalgia, for example. So I'm just curious of what your take is on that.
Okay. As soon as you are sort of wrestling with sort of individual differences in an endocrine realm like this, the usual suspects are either individual differences in how much hormone you're releasing, beta endorphin, or individual differences in the number of receptors, the efficacy of them, their coupling and the target cells to sort of downstream effects. How loud are you yelling, and how sensitive are your ears to the signal coming through? That being a general theme throughout, at the beta endorphin end, my guess is, I don't know this literature well, my guess is a preponderance of insufficient analgesia type disorders. They're much more at the making the beta endorphin end of it rather than the responding to it with receptors. This is because for some reason the pituitary doesn't have huge stores of it, and beta endorphin is made from this precursor molecule that's like this gigantic, it's called POMC, pro-opiomelanocortin, that goes through this insanely complicated processing. It takes a lot of work for the pituitary to make a lot of beta endorphin. It's got an Achilles heel at that end. That's why chronic stress depletes the beta endorphin. My bet is most of the disorders of something with stress or exercise-induced analgesia, it's going to be at the pituitary end rather than the target tissue end.
While we're waiting for the microphone to come over here, one quick question for you, sir. A number of people almost everybody in this room is involved in manual therapy, whether it's physical therapy, massage, et cetera. And some people have taken to referring to it as social grooming. And I understand you have quite a bit of expertise on social grooming. So I was wondering if you could address social grooming as an approach to therapy.
Okay, well, let's see. Let's really, let me go back to my baboon roots. Social grooming is like primates the world over spend an inordinate amount of time doing social grooming of each other. It's morning, like you're not really up to walking around yet, you socially groom. It's the hottest part of the day and you've got a bush to sit under, you socially groom. Something scary happens, you stumble into a sleeping lion, everybody freaks out. When they come down from the trees an hour later, everybody socially grooms, there's a bad fight. Social grooming is sort of this term, sort of the gossip of non-human primates. It's this social glue thing. What's the advantages? Sort of boring versions of is it gets rid of ectoparasites and it also gives nutritional benefits to the one who grooms. grooms because they eat the ectoparasites. Disgusting. But in terms of sort of the more fundamental level, you look at social grooming, it decreases heart rate, it decreases cortisol levels, glucocorticoid levels. There's a relationship between that. One very interesting study looking at how much any given primate was grooming somebody else versus how much they were being groomed. How much they were grooming was the bigger predictor of the lower cortisol levels doing for rather than being done to. So like that one factoid should usher in world peace. So social grooming does all sorts of stuff like that. In the primate world, if you had to make a choice, this is like a truly depressing feature of like this primatological world we are part of. If you are truly distressed, if you're some male baboon and you are immensely distressed after some losing a fight, and you have a choice at that point, what you want to do is reduce your stress response now, reduce your cortisol levels, and you've got a choice. You can either go have a mutual grooming session with someone. You can do most of the grooming, they could do whatever, or you could find somebody smaller to beat up on. And really depressingly, the more effective outlet is displacement aggression. And that's the entire world of what primates do when they are stressed. 50% of baboon aggression is displacement aggression. Middle-ranking male loses a fight, bites a subordinate male who chases after a female who lunges at an infant. All in 15 seconds. What does this mean? You're sitting there minding your own business, bird watching, and somebody else is having a bad day, and you're the one who pays for it. Lack of control, lack of predictability, displacement aggression. Look at what happens when the economy gets bad and spousal abuse, domestic violence goes up. Look what happens. There's been studies showing after the home team sports team loses, in the hours afterward, there's a spike of domestic violence. Unfortunately, primates and rats, the one biting the rat in the cage and feeling better afterward, one of the most effective outlets socially is displacement aggression. And that accounts for such a percentage of the world's miseries. It's horrible.
This question is off point to your lecture, but I have a psychologist I work with that begged me to ask this. She works with transsexuals, and in your Stanford lectures on the limbic system, I think you were talking about the size of the hippocampus, and possibly, I can't remember if you quoted research that said that a missized hippocampus could be the cause of transsexuality.
Okay.
Is that correct?
With an order of approximation of hypothesis, it's along those lines. It's instead this totally bizarre, obscure little nucleus in the hypothalamus called INAH3, and I haven't a clue what that stands for anymore. It once did. This is really interesting, and this is some actual research. This is research done by an extremely good group of neuroanatomists in Holland, and this is a number of replicated studies by now. Okay, this part of the brain, this little nucleus in the hypothalamus, shows a fairly reliable gender difference. There's sex differences all over the brain. People have been studying that forever. And for the most part, the rule is, get 5,000 females of the species and 5,000 males and average out the measures of this, and you'll get statistical significance. There's huge overlaps in these sizes of brain areas where there's on the average a difference. This one nucleus has the most dramatic difference, where almost you can sex a brain by looking at the size of this area. You can't convert it into individual predictability yet, but it's within the range. It's one of the most dramatic differences. So that's the standard picture of sex difference in this part of the hypothalamus. What there's now been is a number of these studies looking at this area of the brain in transgender individuals. And what the studies show is consistently, whether it is before the transition has occurred, whether it is after, whether it is before any hormone treatments or surgery has happened. Another group in one of these studies were elderly individuals who never transitioned but said that they had always wished to. What you see in all these studies is the size of this part of the brain matches what that person says they have always felt themselves to be, not what their body is. That, in my mind, is the best piece of evidence there is that what being transgender is about is not thinking you're a different sex than you actually are. What it is having gotten stuck with a body of the wrong sex than who you actually are. Because the brain gender there seems to come through, consistent finding. And within the realm of measuring areas of the brain in humans, which is messy as hell, it's one of the more reliable findings out there.
We have a question from coming in from the internet.
Yes, it's a two-part question from two people. So Allison asks, with stress, does the increased immunity increase the susceptibility of developing autoimmune disorders? And then the follow-up would be from Brian Rutledge. Would reduction in stress be a clinically meaningful way to treat autoimmune disorders?
Great. Unfortunately, that's like this fiendishly complicated issue in terms of stress and autoimmune disease. So stress enhances immune defenses during the onset of stress. Chronic stress suppresses immune defenses, and synthetic versions of cortisol, prednisone, dexamethasone, etc., can be used as a sledgehammer to flatten the immune system. So it enhances it some of the time and suppresses it others. And this is made even more complicated by the fact that when you have activation of the immune system, one of the chemical messengers of the immune system called interleukin-1 works in the brain to initiate the stress response. In other words, when your immune system is activated, it asks your brain to secrete a hormone that suppresses the immune system. How weird is that? Not in the slightest. What this is a regulatory loop. You've got the onset of some pathogenic challenge, your immune system kicks into action, and you want it to be optimal, but you don't want too much of a good thing. You don't want it barreling into the realm of autoimmunity, and the interpretation is that the delayed immunosuppression of glucocorticoids in those circumstances is just putting your foot on the brake there to let things coast back down to baseline. This makes a very clear prediction, and this was work by somebody, a god in the field, a man named Alan Monk at Dartmouth, who in the 80s made the prediction that all sorts of autoimmune diseases would turn out to have as their underlying problem, you don't put your foot on the brake to coast down the immune system, either not enough secretion of cortisol in those circumstances or insensitivity of immune targets to that putting your foot on the brake effect, and that turns out to be absolutely the case in a whole bunch of disorders. So how does this translate into the clinical world? And this is where it is so messy, because at the same time that major league amounts of stress suppress immunity, and that massive pharmacological doses of synthetic glucocorticoids can be helpful for autoimmune disorders, can be transformational. At the same time, there is a large literature showing periods of stress as a predisposing risk factor for flare-ups of autoimmune diseases. Oh my God, how do you put those pieces together? The same deal again. In this case, a little bit enhancing your immune system. Hey, who doesn't want their immune system enhanced unless you have an autoimmune vulnerability? And severe levels, immunosuppression, severe levels protective from autoimmunity. It's this insanely complicated field built around the fact that clinicians who deal with autoimmune diseases, ever since they were like infants, were being trained to give glucocorticoids in massive doses as corticosteroid immunosuppressants, and they haven't quite been able to incorporate the fact that that same hormone in its natural form in basal levels that increase just a little bit, instead of pouring a lake of the stuff on top of the person's head, does exactly the opposite. Can't be, can't be. It's been clinically very frustrating seeing how slow that field has been to incorporate this sort of inverse U pattern to it. Let's see, there was a second question. Was there a second question?
You got them both.
I got them both.
You got
okay.
them both.
Okay.
So we have another question down here.
Yeah.
Hi, my name is Mai Hung, and my first exposure to your book when I picked it up was in 2007. I remember thinking to myself before I even read it, I said if I was ever in the same room with you that I would ask you why you chose the specific title and why a zebra. And the second question that I have is, now that I'm in more of a hospital-based setting, partaking on the question of social grooming, you had mentioned that the groomer was in a better position than the groomee. Well, could you talk a little bit about perhaps what the stress response might be like and the benefits of a caretaker versus the person who is ill. Thank you.
Okay, taking the second question first, that's in this whole realm of pro-social behavior being something that is reinforcing. It feels good, sufficiently so that philosophers for the last 10,000 years have argued, are there ever such things as pure altruistic acts, or are they always for some version of the self-esteem, reputation, whatever that comes from doing that? What you see in that domain is, of course, it depends on how much. A moderate amount of caretaking is wonderful, and as everyone knows, being, say, the 80-year-old primary caretaker for your 83-year-old demented spouse is a death sentence. And studies have been done showing, for example, mothers of children with severe chronic diseases, the more years they've been the main caretaker, the more accelerated aging there is of their chromosomes and their immune system. This was this landmark observation from UCSF in the 90s. You want to get it right in the optimal range. So you want to be a caretaker, but you don't want it to be taking over your life. This is very relevant to something interesting in terms of gerontology and successful aging. What you find is among aging men, having a few close friends is a predictor of successful aging and longer life expectancy. Among women, it's not. How come? Because women are more picky than men. It's not only have to be friendships, but they have to be good friendships that are reciprocal and symmetrical. I mean, a guy like watches football with somebody once a month, and that gives him 10 years of life expectancy there. With women, what the symmetry is about, what is an asymmetric social relationship for an elderly woman? She's being the caretaker of a friend, either de facto or de jure. That's how it comes out. In terms of the title of the book, so I've spent about 30 summers in the Serengeti studying my baboons, and this is the time of year where there's this massive migration of 2 million wildebeest and about 1 million zebra coming through, and wildebeest are the most boring, inane, chaotic organisms on Earth, and they have no interactions with each other. And like looking at, like if you could look at a herd of wildebeest above, they would look like you've just scattered sand all over the place. Look at the zebra, and what you see is it's like looking at families on a beach. They're always making physical contact with a family member, and they're nuzzling and all of that. So, like, I like zebras. Nonetheless, amid that, they're not the sharpest animals out there cognitively, and sort of the premise of the whole book being, you know, if you're a normal mammal, stress is a short-term crisis, all of that. They're not smart enough to get psychologically stressed. You see some lion come out and run after a zebra, and the zebra runs like mad and gets away and pants, and the lion skulks off, and it's fairly obvious that within about 10 seconds, the zebra has absolutely no memory of what just happened. Oh, look, some more grass to eat, and just goes back to that. They seem like the poster children for stressors are very, very quickly forgotten because they're not very cognitively sophisticated, but they look very sweet with each other.
Well, that's the secret right there. To get rid of our stress is to just cut out the memory.
Yes, yes. When it comes to mental health, truth and beauty don't always go hand in hand. Occasionally, a good dose of denial does wonders. Reality can only be finessed so far with psychological means.
We have one last question right up here up front.
So thinking of like Vincent Folletti's adverse childhood experiences study, how much control can changing the environment in adulthood have in modifying stress reactivity? Like how much variability is available compared to the influence of prenatal and childhood environments or genetic predispositions?
Great. Okay. Huge trendy field these days is epigenetics, which is this whole world by which experience doesn't change your genes because it doesn't work that way, but experience could change how readily your genes are activated or inactivated. And the thing about epigenetics that got everybody like drooling is that these are all sorts of mechanisms by which environmental factors can cause regulatory changes in genes that could be even lifelong. that could be even multi-generational, that are passed on in prenatal environment from mother to offspring. Unbelievably interesting. Unbelievably interesting. Here's cutting-edge molecular biology showing why childhood matters and why childhood matters for a long time afterwards. So incredibly exciting stuff. And then next door, you have the people who are depressed as hell by this finding, the people who are trying to understand adult resilience and adult plasticity, because everything that they study as well is that very little is set in stone in the adult brain. The biggest revolution in neuroscience of the last quarter century is overturning for the last 10,000 years. You take Intro Neuro 101 and they teach you the adult brain doesn't make new neurons. Turns out the adult brain does. In certain really interesting outposts under certain brain plasticity, the brain that rebuilds itself meets early experience, has lifelong, even multi-generational, unchangeable effects. Where do those pieces come together? And what you see is, like, the nearest thing I can get to sort of a soundbite with it is early effects in life, and to a huge extent, environment does not begin at birth. So a big chunk of it is prenatal. Early effects in life can be long, long lasting, can be multi-generational, and that is never more the case than when it's early childhood adversity. There's very little of what's caused by that, though, that is not reversible by some sort of adult intervention, but the longer you wait, the more of an uphill battle it's going to be. And I think most broadly, that's how those two pieces fit together.
All right. Dr. Sapolsky, thank you so much. You can all put your forelimbs together now to express your